don't know if you can tell by the smile on my face, but the day is finally here. Rick Beato talks to Brendan O'Brien for 3 hours, and if anybody knows me, you know I care about this. So let's just check this out. Some drum talk, because I'm about to record drums this weekend, so I want to focus for a second on the drums and stuff he used to do to make stuff sound amazing. Right here, he's talking about the Red Hot Chili Peppers when he engineered all the stuff on Blood Sugar Sex Magik and how they got that magical drum sound, okay? Now, the songs will differ in terms of drum sound, and right now he's about to talk about Give It Away, which was recorded in a different room than most of the rest of the drums on this album, okay? And he uses, talk about his favorite reverb that he would use on drums, but in general, most of the drum sounds on that record came from the fact that they were in big rooms with natural sounding big reverbs, just naturally in the room. All right, check this out. I don't want to let go too far. I'm just this is fair use for teaching purposes. I'm so excited I can't hardly talk. Brendan O'Brien starts out by talking about Give It Away.
That's not the drums in the main room. There was a little room off to the side, and I think they call it a solarium. I don't really know what it was, but it was all marble. The whole room was marble. I know it had marble floors. I don't remember if it had marble walls or not, but there was no deadening in that room whatsoever.
Is all the reverb I'm hearing there natural, or did you add reverb after?
I think on this record, I added very little actual. One of my things I always used from day one was the big EMT 250.
Okay.
Greatest thing ever.
Explain to people that don't know what that is.
Well, in your Pro Tools rigs, you have an EMT 250 plug-in, which is pretty good.
Yeah.
But this was like the original digital reverb. It's about this tall, maybe this tall, and has big handles on it.
Big levers, yeah.
It does one thing. It only does one thing. But that one thing it does was essential to records that I was making. And so I don't think I made a record without one, or
and
mixed a record.
And what would you use that on? That
drums,
would be on drums predominantly.
Because you could mix it with the drums, and it would just sound like the room. But that's all just that room.
That's it. Because the drums sound different from track to track.
That's a kick. I think of that song, if I remember correctly, is a kick drum mic, a snare mic, and 2 mics. Because we were in a hurry.
Yeah.
Let's try it in here, see how it sounds.
Like 2 large diaphragm condensers or something, right?
I don't remember.
Who knows? Okay, on tape though. On tape.
But that's 4. I think that's 4 mics of that particular song.
The vocals are dry. Are they totally dry, or is there a small room on them? Because you don't use a lot of reverb on a lot lot of those early records.
Again, that was all Rick's sort of thing.
That's Rick's thing, right? He was very into dry.
He liked them very compressed and very. No, I don't think there's any reverb or anything on those songs.
What is the benefit of that, having an ambient drum part and having a dry vocal? Because it's
I don't know,
in your face.
It sounds good.
It sounds good.
Well, the ambient drum parts were, for me, specifically a product of where we were.
Okay.
If we'd been in a very dead house, they would all been dead sounding. I mean, that's just the way. And the main room we had, it was a big room. Someone ages before taught me this trick with gates. It worked great in this room with Chad. Chad's a great drummer. And for some reason, his hi-hat level and it kind of all worked out where I would, if you hear reverb on the drums or snare or the kick on that record, it's all the room opening up with gates. It's not a reverb unit. It's all the room opening up.
So you're talking about the snare reverb is the room mics opening up and creating the reverb on the snare.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And I think I just had a couple of room mics and maybe just
Is this
one.
something that you would do later on too?
Yeah, but not often with that kind of success.
Okay. And did you do that in mix then on an SSL? Do you remember if you mixed it in an SSL?
I did mix in an SSL, but if I remember correctly, I would always do that with drummer gates.
Drummer gates,
because of the keying and that kind of stuff. But worked great.
So you can really isolate where the snare drum hits. You kind of EQ where that is.
I use samples on all my records. I don't know if I used a sample a lot on this record. I did some, but we had such good. They sounded so good the way they were.
And
compression and everything.
And using a sample is to get above the if there's hash in the snare drum microphone, things like that, to trigger reverb, so you got to clean. I mean, there's a lot of good reasons to do that.
Just added a little more impact. Yeah. And sometimes, honestly, when you're recording, when you're doing basic tracks, sometimes you're just trying to get everybody in the room.
Yeah.
And getting along, and playing the same song. And hoping magic happens. And sometimes magic happens, the snare's not great.
Some good stuff here. Let's unpack it. Number one, you don't need a ton of mics to get a great drum sound if your drummer's balanced, In other words, he's not playing the cymbals significantly louder than he's playing the skins. A lot of great drummers know how to hit cymbals where they're holding back a little on the cymbals so that they can lay into the skins, or they're playing just in general. You know, when you play too hard on anything, you wind up suffocating the tone a lot. It's the same reason if you like leave the beater on a kick drum and you lay into it, it's a very different sound if you leave the beater on the head as soon as you hit it compared to if you just hit it and let the beater come off it. You get a much more resonant sound of the drum when you do that. If you tune the drums really well and you have a balanced drummer, you could use 4 mics like Chad Smith used, you know, when Brendan O'Brien mic'd him up for Give It Away on Blood Sugar Sex Magic, and you can get that amazing sound of a giant big room using only 4 mics, okay? Now, he talks about kick drum, snare drum being close mic, and then we don't know if they're technically overheads he used or if he just, you know, backed them up enough where they're room mics. Like, it's not really clear in here how it was done, whether they were overheads or rooms, but when you listen to the sound of the drums on that song, Give It Away, they sound very reverbed in a nice way. Okay, so it's possible he was using them as more of room mics and not directly over top of the drums, and just how balanced Chad plays may have created that amazingness. You'll notice Brendan also talks about how when they're in the living room, the big room, not the solarium, so the other songs on the album, what you'll notice is, you know, he mentions this gating technique on the rooms. And he specifically says the living room before he talks about that. So I'm almost thinking that those 2 other mics on Give It Away were more like overheads, and maybe he didn't use this exact trick on there, but the trick he mentions about gated room mics, we got to talk about that for a second. This is one that, in order to make it work, I just want to kind of give you some things that I picked up along the way that make this work better than others. One, the type of gate you use is very critical. For example, the drummer gate is great for a few reasons. One, it has a key input, so you can key it to something like the snare, just like you would do on an external side chain. In other words, a side chain that is keyed from something else, like a compressor, for example, a sidechain compressor. Let's say you got that on the bass. And every time the kick hits, it's going to be keyed to the kick, so it's going to duck the compressor down every time the kick hits to allow the kick to come through the mix, and the bass will just sort of get naturally lowered a little bit every time the kick hits. That's normal use of a sidechain compressor, you know, an external sidechain compressor, okay? Now, internal sidechain compression is different. That's like for on a mix bus. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about external sidechain compression, okay? Now, when it comes to a gate, it's similar if you can key it to the snare, but works in the opposite way. In other words, it will open up the sound, you know, explode, if you will. It'll open it up when the snare hits, if it's keyed to the snare. Now, this is part of the reason the drums sound so huge and big on that album. But the beautiful thing about the drummer gate is also the fact that you can set not only the key, you can do more than just key it. You can set filters on it. So the filters will basically decide which frequencies will be gating and which won't, there's so much to it, that gate. That's why that works so well. Also, the speed of it. You can, you know, it's a super fast gate. I don't remember the microseconds, but it's really fast. It also has like a FET front end, if I'm not mistaken. So there's reasons that gate works so well, and you can't just use the SSL gate, for example. It's not the same. So keep this stuff in mind. Also, other tricks that you could use to enhance this. You know, he mentions using samples, you know, sometimes to get, like, for example, if the take was great, but the snare sound wasn't that great, you can use a sample to make up for it. But this is how I want you to look at it also when we're talking about room mics and gating. Something you should think about is when you're having your drummer set up, get him to play each drum before you start. That's a common technique. But then what you're going to do is basically replace each respective drum's room sound with the hit without the cymbal on it. Okay, and then you're gonna blend in the room sound, but basically you want the gates triggering to open up off that sampled sound that you created. In other words, all the mics are live when you're getting your sounds. You have the drummer play each drum individually, and you're going to use those room sounds to trigger these gates to open, because that way they won't be as affected by cymbals and other things happening. You will blend in your room mics, the real room mics, with that blend to taste, but you'll be able to get a control, way more of a control on what is happening on your room sounds and how much the drum explodes out of the room sound and not the cymbals. Because if there's a lot of cymbals playing, this technique doesn't work very well. That's also why you notice him say, he's tried this technique on other things with less success, because, and he mentions Chad Smith's hi-hat. You know, if you focus on that part, there's a lot of detail in what he's saying there. He's basically saying Chad plays so balanced that he could do this and it sounded great. And that's what he's saying. In other words, because the cymbal sound isn't so much louder than the skins, in the room itself, those room mics are picking up a good balance of skins compared to cymbals, which is why this works. So, you know, ways around that are that with that sample technique I described, but he didn't have to use that in this way on that song, you know, on the whole album, because of Chad's balance. Okay, so there's just all stuff to keep in mind. And if you have, you know, it's not always a good idea to go into a recording session and try to change the way the drummer plays. That'll put you behind the 8 ball from the jump. So I wouldn't recommend being like, hey, just so you know, play the cymbals more quiet, man. You know, unless you have somebody open to listening to what you're saying. But it's not always a good idea to try to change the way people play right before they record. You know, it could go bad. Just letting you know. Get out in front of that. It could go bad. So anyway, there's so much to this, right? I just love listening to him explain his different techniques. Also, the contrast between vocals being close and in your face and drums having a lot of room sound to them. There's something really cool about that. You don't always have to look at it like everything needs to sound like it's recorded in the same room, because that sounds amazing on this whole album sounds amazing. So let's just realize that it doesn't have to be that way. Also, they would have been able to get an amazing sounding album no matter where they are, no matter where they were. And that's what he mentioned. If they happened to be in a place that was dead, it would have been dead sounding drums. They were in a place that was big. So don't look at it like your recording facility, whatever that is, isn't good enough. You can get what you're trying to get out of anything. And especially you lean into what you have going on. That's basically what he was saying. In other words, if it was dead, you lean into the dead. But again, even with dead, there's tricks to get more out of the sounds. Here's another one if you haven't heard this already. You could do this after the fact or while you're recording, but you could basically pump into the room more skin sounds of the drums by using like a PA system and using a close mic setup. Like the mic, you're basically pumping the kick, the snare, and the tom sounds, the close mics only, back into the room while you're tracking. This kind of thing works especially good for cross stick sections where you're trying to bring up the sound of the cross stick, okay? Because all your room mics will capture that. And then it'll sound it'll basically take the cymbal level and lower it and raise up the level of the skins in the room itself when you're recording. Now, again, this doesn't always work. I'm just giving you all sorts of stuff that I picked up along the way that doesn't hurt to know, okay? It doesn't hurt to know this stuff. Whatever your facility, you can get great sounds even if you only have 4 mics on drums, because that's what he had on Give It Away, okay? And with techniques like this room gating thing, you could really start to bring out the length of drums, because that's what it is. When you got a gate that opens up, when you hit the snare loud and then closes down, it's basically giving you an explosion every time the drums hit. You know, and you're keying it to the snare, for example, so that every time the snare hits, you get that snare explosion in the room mics. And then the rest of the time, it's sort of more tame when they're closed. You sometimes want the gate to close relatively quickly, and then you can sort of put a reverb on the gate to smooth it out. But it's better almost to have that happen than for it to sort of take it, like, in order rather than it taking the entire sound and then close. In other words, sometimes it's better to make it more like a shot of sound and then to cut out and then just smooth it out with something. Also, sometimes the gate is good when it's like, you know, when it's opening up and then it's getting quieter by, you know, 6-8 dB roughly. Like, you don't always have to make it where it's totally on or totally off. But play with how it's set. There's no point for me giving you exact settings. You gotta listen, you gotta use your ears, and you gotta determine what works, because it's a lot of times just dependent on the groove that's being played, the pattern that's being played, whether it's on the ride or the cymbals, the way the drummer's crashing. It may not work. So it could work and it could not work. It's not like there's settings to make this work, all right? And also another thing, if you're gonna use, you know, compression on room mics, play with different compressors, because not every compressor is good for that. Every compressor is different. So play with it. Use different ones. See what you like, given the song, given the pattern, given the drummer, given the style of music. There's so much stuff here, okay? So you guys got this. I don't want to go too crazy, but this is an awesome interview. There's so much to pull from it. I hope you dug it. Subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. Comment on anything that I may have missed or something that you like to do with stuff like this. Talk to you guys soon. My name's Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. You guys got this.